and continuing our series interviewing consultants. I have the pleasure of interviewing Sara Leonard of the Sara Leonard Group. She has over 30 years experience primarily in fundraising and fund development. She also does board retreats and some governance training, but just absolutely fantastic background. And she's going to help share with us what a board needs to understand about fundraising and fund development. So please join me and welcome Sara. As you heard in the introduction, I'm interviewing a good friend of mine, Sara Leonard of the Sara Leonard Group. I've known Sara for a number of years, referred her many times. She's an absolutely fundraising guru, but I'm going to let her tell you about herself. So Sara, if you just tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you came to form the Sara Leonard Group.
Okay, I can do that. My first job right out of college was in banking, and I thought I was going into the family business. My dad had always worked in finance, and I learned pretty quickly it was not a good fit for me. And through some volunteer work that I was being recruited for, I had a chance to interview for a fundraising job. And I haven't looked back. That was over 30 years ago. And I've raised money at very large organizations, hospitals, a university, but also at very small organizations where I was the only fundraising staff. And in 2012, I joined the staff of the Nonprofit Leadership Center of Tampa Bay to create their fundraising curriculum. At that job, I had a chance to do some consulting and coaching in addition to training and realized I loved it. So I launched the Sara Leonard Group in order to do consulting, mostly around board governance and fundraising for nonprofits.
And so what year was that you founded the Sara Leonard Group?
I didn't know there was going to be a quiz. That was 2015.
Oh, very good. Okay, so you've been doing it a while, and that's actually a nonprofit organization is just absolutely fantastic up in Tampa, so you've associated with a good one. I know you still can contribute to that. But one of the things, and certainly why I have you on the podcast, is to talk about fundraising. And as we work with boards, there's always that sense of, they don't understand it, they don't know about it, or they think they do. And so we want to help educate board members that are listening. So just to start off with some of the basics, what are some different types of fundraising that nonprofit organizations need to be aware of, or what are opportunities for them?
And there are as many types of fundraising as there are nonprofits. So thousands of different types of fundraising, but some general categories. We usually start by talking about annual giving, which is exactly as it sounds, a gift that you hope a donor will repeat at least annually, sometimes more often. And that would include special events, year-end giving efforts, a scholarship campaign, specific things that people will give to over and over. And then we hope to move people into a major gifts category where they're making a gift they wouldn't make every year. And that varies person to person, but more significant gifts. And included in that is capital campaign fundraising, which the name is a little misleading. It's not always for a capital project. So now the terminology is comprehensive campaign fundraising, meaning it could be for an endowment fund or a program expansion, but it's a concentrated effort where you're asking people to make their best gifts, their largest gifts. And then the final type of fundraising is planned giving fundraising, where a person leaves you in their estate or makes you part of their will or their estate plan. We kind of joke and say no donor gives you their last dollar, but in planned giving, that's what we're asking people to do, is make an intentional commitment while they're alive for something that will happen after they're gone.
It's interesting, as you just outlined that, it almost sounds like there's some type of continuation or process, a pathway. You start with one and then you work your way down. Is that very intentional? Is that designed that way? If you had a pretty solid development department, is that how organizations look at it?
Yes, it is. And that's typically how a donor engages with a nonprofit. Their first gift is usually an annual gift. They attend a special event, or they see something on a social media channel and make a moderate gift, and it's moderate for the donor. And then once they get to know the organization better and engage with the organization the donor is likely to make a larger gift.
Yep,
And
that
then
makes sense.
when they've had a long relationship with the organization, the donor starts thinking about, what's my legacy here?
So when people say we're going to start some type of legacy program and next year we're going to have a whole bunch of money, it probably doesn't work like that.
It never works like that. And also sometimes executive directors or boards will say to me they want to jump right into major gift fundraising. Well, I mean, don't we all? But the concept is you have to meet people at some point, and annual giving is usually where you meet those donors.
So
Usually people don't make a 6 or 7 figure gift as their first gift. And Mackenzie Scott, who has been a significant donor the past few years, she has busted that and does make significant first time gifts, but most donors don't.
that makes sense. So if we're in, what conditions need to exist for a nonprofit to be successful at fundraising?
Ooh, well, that's a big question.
I ask big questions.
If it were a simple answer, I would have sold that by now and
Yes, you
wouldn't
would
be
have.
working anymore. But okay, let's think about some of those factors. And this is, I think, where we're going with this whole conversation. One of the most important characteristics is that everybody in the organization is participating in fundraising, which is very different than everybody in the organization asking strangers for money. That nobody wants that. But an organization that values philanthropic support, that thinks about donors and how to get them engaged with an organization, those are the ones that are successful. It's it's like a sport. If it were one person on a football field, they can run the ball down the field. But if it's a whole team, we're going to do better. And if it's the whole team of the organization working to move that ball down the field, it's going to go better.
And it's almost a culture. It sounds like I've heard the term a culture of philanthropy within the
Mm-hmm.
nonprofit, and really that exists. That is something because some nonprofits don't have it.
Right. It exists, and it often doesn't exist. And it starts at the top with the
Uh,
CEO or executive director. It includes the board as leadership. And then when it works really well, it filters through every part of an organization where a staff person who's providing programs and services isn't asking for money, but they know where the money came from and they know how to share the message with the community.
oh, that's a really good point. So, and you mentioned the board. What is the board's responsibility in fundraising or fund development?
Mm-hmm. The board has ultimate responsibility in that. When we talk about board roles and responsibilities, we include, I'm going to try to get the wording right, the board is responsible for ensuring the nonprofit has the resources to accomplish its mission. And that, and I'm sure you've done entire podcasts on this, that is a mix of revenue sources. It's earned income and grants. Sometimes it's federal funding or
Mm.
fee for service, but it also should include philanthropic support, fundraising. So the board has ultimate responsibility for making sure that's the right mix, and they have responsibility for leading and guiding that.
So, what do you find in your experience boards misunderstand about fundraising?
Yeah, they think that it's about asking strangers for
Yeah.
money. Sometimes they think it's about selling candy bars, and it's not. We don't typically do that kind of fundraising. And now that my kids are out of the house, I'm not having to sell you anything.
Yes.
We've all been there. But, and some board members who are comfortable with fundraising will take kind of the opposite approach and say, give me the names and numbers, and I'll ask anybody for anything. That doesn't usually work either. We
Mm.
need relationships. We need the board members to help build relationships with the organization. And it makes board members nervous thinking they have to guilt their friends into supporting the organization. We don't want that, but we do want them to introduce the organization to their friends, families, colleagues. One of the things I do at board retreats at introductions is I ask board members to tell a little bit about themselves, but share with us how you came to be involved in this organization. Who or what brought you here? And it's fun because they're usually in the room. Often they're in the room, but I make the point, you're not mad at that person for introducing you to this
Ah,
organization. They've changed your life for the better. You are glad to be here. You are glad to be making a difference in the community. And a board member who doesn't share the mission of their organization is denying the people around them that opportunity.
well stated. I love that because you're right. I mean, people got introduced somehow to it,
Mhm.
and there's this perspective of fundraising that there's this fear, and like, no, it's just really just introductions and telling the story. I got a question for you, we touched on this a minute ago about the culture of philanthropy. So, if there is no culture of philanthropy, how long? And there's no right or wrong answer. Do you think it takes an organization to develop that culture?
64 days, exactly
Exactly. See,
64 days. You're right. There is no right or wrong answer. And it's culture of philanthropy is not something like the temperature of the room. You can't say it's 72 degrees, but you can start from one place and move toward it. For instance, one of the indicators of a culture of philanthropy is the board makes donations. They support with their personal or corporate dollars. And an organization may start from a place where no board members are giving or one or two board members are giving. And one way to improve your culture of philanthropy is get more of them giving and get it to half the first 6 months of the year. Let's get it to 90% by the end of the fiscal year. And then next fiscal, our goal is 100%. And there are all the factors of a culture of philanthropy: thinking gratefully about your community, being transparent, having the whole organization understand that you're a nonprofit and why. Any of those factors can be judged on a scale. So let's figure out where we are now, where we want to be, and then let's start making some steps toward that.
I love how you outline that because oftentimes, and again, I'm gonna go back to this. I'll be, facilitating a board retreat, and somebody said, "Let's
Mm-hmm.
hire a development person so we can raise $1 million next year." And I'm like, I know enough to know that that's not going to work. That it really
Right.
is. But I like how you frame that. You start small, and it's right. You're gonna if you get into fundraising, you're gonna do it into perpetuity. You would think.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't happen all at once, but it's these milestones along the way, and you're building that culture and that the process, the system.
Right. Right. And board members, especially, but also executive directors, sometimes misunderstand that when they hire a development person, the staff person, the development staff, is bringing donors with them from one organization to the next. And there are professions where you can do that, where you have a book of business
Yeah.
and you bring your clients or you bring your customers with you. Fundraising doesn't work like that. First, it's illogical. If a donor loves the symphony and the staff member moves to a hospital, there may not be a match there. And second, it's unethical because the donor
Mm.
belongs to the nonprofit, not to that development staff or the board member.
So you brought up the hiring of a development person, and I've been intrigued as I watch successful organizations. The CEO, executive director, and the development person have a very tight, important relationship, and it's almost like that has to happen before success is realized. So what
That is an
is that?
astute observation.
Okay,
And you had a podcast episode on the board chair and the CEO's relationship, and it's very similar. It's about trust. And sometimes an executive director thinks they can hire a fundraising staff person, a development director, and then they don't have to think about fundraising. It's not
right.
that at all. But those two people should be working together, thinking about the prospects, what the relationships are that exist, where you can build more, how you're moving those along. And a good CEO will build that trust with their development director and vice versa, and then they can work as a team.
And almost like that has to happen to be successful. It's just when you see it, it's magical,
Mhm.
but it's not always the case. It's
Right.
interesting. I'll just leave it at that. Pretty interesting.
Right. There was an article a number of years ago, 10 Ways to Lose Your Development Director. And one of them was reward good performance with unrealistic goals. And I see that happen a lot. The development staff with the board and the CEO had a great year. So then let's make their goal the next year completely unrealistic. And there are enough development jobs that a development staff person doesn't usually have to stay in
Yeah.
those conditions.
Yeah, yeah, that's actually very wise advice to any board chair or CEO that's listening. Very wise advice. So let's talk a little bit about your consulting practice. When do boards or CEOs bring you in to consult, and who typically brings you in?
Okay, that's a big question too. So when, the first question, usually when they want to do something better. I, I certainly have met with some organizations who are interested in building their fundraising strength, but they don't want to do what it's going to take. And often they think that a consultant can come in with magic answers or with my own list of donors, which I don't have. So hopefully an organization is ready to do the work, and we'll look at what they've been doing, what's working, what's missing, what they can add. And I really work with a variety of organizations. I typically medium to large
Hmm.
sizes, but sometimes even small and sometimes even new. And I do a lot of coaching where I work with the executive director who doesn't have the strength in fundraising and wants to build that muscle. Sometimes I work with the development staff when they're new to the organization or newer to development, and can help them address situations as they come up. And I do a lot of board training. When I started the nonprofit leadership center, I thought I would be teaching fundraising to fundraisers, and I learned pretty quickly, and it's held true, still teaching there and in my consulting practice, that it's teaching fundraising to CEOs and board members as much as it is to development staff.
Interesting. So, is it just because of the for board members no experience in it? I mean, right? Because most board members they're not from the nonprofit space.
Right. Right. And fundraising and sales and marketing have some similarities, but they're not exactly the same. So with board members, it's often getting them comfortable with it and explaining to them that it's not taking advantage of their friends, not out talking to strangers, that it's finding their comfort level and building on that
And so the different types of consulting you do, you'll train, but then we also do capital campaign. Do you come in because I know that's a
too.
okay,
Yeah, I do capital campaign work also, and it starts before a capital campaign, usually
right?
with a planning study where, as a consultant, I can do some research in the community and talk to an organization's key stakeholders and help them form a plan and set a goal. And then I can stay with the organization during a capital campaign and help them activate their volunteers and do all the kind of nitty gritty stuff, naming opportunities and giving levels and tracking progress with prospects.
Oh, please talk about naming opportunities because that's another one I talk to people. Well, just they'll throw their name up, and I
Mhm.
go, there's a whole science behind. I mean, a strategy behind naming, and if you have not thought through it, you could really
Mhm.
come out on the wrong side of things with a donor.
Yes, I've been yelled at about that. Very early in my fundraising career, I was working at a hospital, an older established hospital, and two auxiliary volunteers pulled me into my office and closed the door. And I just got an earful because one of them was from a family who had supported the hospital for generations. And the room that they had named a couple of decades prior was now literally a broom closet. It was
Oh no.
janitorial supplies, and she was not happy, nor should she have been. But it taught me very early on about what we promise donors and how we stay in touch with them, because a hospital or a school or a homeless shelter. I mean, any nonprofit is going to change the use of their spaces. So it takes some advanced thought on how long is this name going to last? And then what are we going to do when that becomes a janitorial supply closet? There are other ways to honor that donor. And that was one of the fun things, ended up being fun, working with that family and making sure they were recognized. But then also making sure that the naming opportunities are equitable, that the size of the gift matches the size of the space, and that the intention of the gift fits with the space. And then the juicy, interesting stories are when a named space, when the donor who has named this space has some kind of trouble and the space
Oh,
needs to be renamed. So the nonprofits who manage those things the best are the ones who think about it in advance and have, this won't surprise you, policies and procedures, gift agreements with the donor
yeah.
so the donor understands, and it spells out what the donor will provide, what the nonprofit will provide. And one of the things I love about the fundraising profession is how willing my development colleagues are to share samples. And when we get together, we've all been through all these bizarre situations, name changes or arrests. And somebody will have a policy sample that they can share with you. And as a consultant, I do a lot of that, sharing resources. I'm not going to charge you for a sample of a naming opportunity policy. I'll happily share that with nonprofits.
But you can certainly by educating the nonprofit, your client, you gonna probably save them a lot of pain down the road. And it may not be till 20 years from now, 30 years from now, but stuff can rear its ugly head sometime
Right.
down the, yeah. And just that thought process, again, people say, look, we're going to start a campaign. And I always go, ooh, man, I hope you bring in a consultant and really think about this, because it's not as simple as just starting tomorrow if you want to
Right.
do it right.
Right. And the staff that you already have, the fundraising staff and the executive staff of the nonprofit, are already working pretty hard. I've not met any nonprofit staff members who don't have enough to do. And then you add a capital campaign on top of what they're already doing. That just doesn't make sense. And to bring in consulting help, to add staff, is so important. A nonprofit has to put some resources into a campaign or it's not going to be successful.
Ooh, I like that. Yeah, that makes sense. And it's not just, again, you don't just start tomorrow. It's a thought process, but then it can be very successful. And I would suggest probably help re-engage or help build the culture of the organization. It becomes a way of doing business and just affirms all the goodness is being done.
Right.
Hmm.
Right. And I'm such a fundraising nerd. I have taken pictures in the bathroom at the Georgia Aquarium
Oh, yeah, yeah.
because I don't remember which company now, but one of the water companies had named spaces in the women's room, and my daughter was young and so embarrassed. But I'm like, this is a great idea because it matched the
Yep.
philosophy of the company, the water
Oh,
conservation and the aquarium. And so there was their name inside the bathroom. I didn't check the men's room, but if anybody has and wants to share a picture, that'd be okay.
that's too funny. Very good. Well, Sarah, you certainly have a wealth of information, and you've helped so many nonprofits in our community. If somebody's interested in learning more about you and getting in touch with you, how do they find Sara Leonard?
Well, you have to spell my name right. It's Sara, no H,
No H.
but it's saraleonardgroup.com. And I'm also on LinkedIn. That's an easy way to find me.
Yeah, always easy to catch you on LinkedIn. So, Sarah, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast today and helping board members that are thinking about, or just help them understand a little bit more about fundraising and fund development. And thank you for what you're doing in our community.
Oh, absolutely, Michael. Thank you for having me.
Now, time for recapping with Reed. Reed, what did you learn from Sarah?
The most successful fundraising organizations have a culture of philanthropy, and that means that everybody in the organization is participating in fundraising. That doesn't mean they're all asking for money, but they all have that mindset of participation in fundraising.
Yeah, very good. Number 2.
An often misunderstood part of fundraising from the board's perspective is it's not your role to guilt people into the donating. We're not guilting people into donating to the organization. We're connecting donors to the organization and giving people the opportunity to provide support to an organization that they might not otherwise have known was even possible.
So true. And number 3.
A good indicator if your organization has a culture of philanthropy is that the entire board makes a personal gift every year.
Every year. That's absolutely right. There you go, ladies and gentlemen. Recapping with Breed, his 3 takeaways from our interview with Sara Leonard. And I will 501 see you next week.